Hello, everyone. Welcome to our additional targeted support and improvement virtual convening. I'm Shirley Vargas, and I'm the administrator over the Office of Coordinated School and District Support here at the NDE.
And I'm Carr, our Director of Accountability and AQuESTT, and we're thankful that you would join us today.
And thank you so much for joining us virtually. We know that we'd really love to be present with you all, and we really want to be as flexible as possible. So for today's sessions, we have three main objectives. And we're going to be engaging and conducting in a resource allocation review that will help us to determine any inequities that exist in our schools and systems and chart next steps. We're also going to deepen our understanding around something we may have heard across the entire state and nation, which is around evidence-based practices and how we can determine what's the best fit for our schools. And then lastly, we're also going to be networking throughout the entire session as we're going to be engaging in breakout rooms and exploring some equity-centered tools and resources. So we want to make sure that we set the purpose for this session here. And what we want to do is we want to ensure the academic and lifetime success of our diverse learners. So what we're going to be doing is really assessing and supporting the conditions that are necessary to make sure that happens.
In addition, this is, as you may know, ATSI, Additional Targeted Support and Improvement, is a designation that is federally mandated. The Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, requires that additional supports and information from schools that have been designated from ATSI is collected by the education agency, or in this case, us at the NDE. So as Shirley mentioned, this resource allocation, we're going to engage in a high-level beginning conversation around that, as well as a discussion around evidence-based practices. We will be sending out a follow-up survey to this session that will ask you for those, for some information specifically about what is occurring within your school. We also like to just ensure that we're setting some context. So you may have seen this definition of education equity. It's one that NDE has been using for the past couple of years and been talking about quite a bit as we think about the resources that our students need at the right moment, at the right level, and with the right intensity. Especially today as we talk about evidence-based practices and resource allocation, that piece is absolutely critical. Our final objective today is really kind of getting to that idea of high expectations for learning and ensuring that we have the right mindsets and knowledge to really serve our students and to implement those new resources or those resources that we already have well. Additionally, we've been trying to think about and reframe this idea of an achievement gap. So as long as we in Nebraska have been evaluating students using summative assessments, we have seen achievement gaps. But what we've been pushed to reconsider with our partners at the Midwest and Plains Equity Center, whose site we will actually explore a little bit later, is that we should no longer be considering these as achievement gaps, but rather that these are opportunity gaps. And we as educators and we as the adults in the system need to think about the ways that we can refocus and create those equitable opportunities to learn that ultimately serve all of our students, and especially those that have been historically marginalized.
And we also know that we want to continue to pair the importance between and amongst accountability and school improvement. And we have 4 core beliefs that really underpin our work. And the first is around taking an asset-based approach and valuing the work that's already taking place in our schools. The second really is around focusing that all schools can improve regardless of any designation or classification. The third is around demography not being a destiny, and that a demographic factor of a particular student or student group does not necessarily determine their ultimate success. And then lastly, that school improvement is fundamentally about equity, and that the way in which we're going about providing differentiated support for our schools, it's around ensuring that we're providing our schools and our systems the supports when they need them. And because we're in a virtual learning space, we want to just provide some virtual learning norms. And we want to make sure that we remain present, engaged, and courageous. So some of the conversations will feel somewhat vulnerable because we're asking ourselves to peel back the onion. And we're going to be doing that in a virtual learning space. So you'll be in breakout rooms with people that you may or may not know. So we want to make sure that we stay present and are engaged and courageous in those conversations. We also ask that you take and maintain an inquiry stance and know that if you're asked questions, that it really is around taking a stance of learning than for judgment. The other is remaining student focused. So every decision, everything that we do is in service of our students. We want to make sure that we keep them at the center, as what we do will ultimately affect their outcomes. And then lastly, some of you may already know some of these things. You may have heard these things in different presentations throughout your experiences, and we want to make sure that we don't stay focused on that, but rather we move to action and think about now what? What can we do differently? Now, if I'm hearing this again, what new spin can I take on this? So just keep those things in mind as we go throughout our learning today.
Excellent. So we want to make sure that we position the additional targeted support and improvement designation in the context of the broader education ecosystem and accountability. So we're going to spend just a quick second kind of talking about ATSI as a designation and how those classifications also all work together. So just very high level, as you know, every school in the state of Nebraska and every district in the state of Nebraska is classified annually. That is a state law that we have to have levels of classification. You'll notice here that we actually had more schools than we have previously in the good, great, and excellent categories. We did not force a distribution of our schools like we used to with a 10-40-40 split. So we've kept the cut points the same, pretty much the same as the year prior in that 2018 classification. And we actually saw, as we all know, that when we hold that steady, that schools rose to the occasion and met those high expectations, and that we moved up in those classifications. In addition, the capacity at the NDE and with our ESUs and districts even is limited. And we all know that we have to be strategic about the way that we deploy our resources. So at NDE, we have 3 ways of really supporting the schools that most need improvement. And those 3 ways are detailed here in these designations. With our comprehensive support and improvement, which is a federal designation, priority schools, which is a state designation and our most intensive level of support, and targeted support and improvement and additional targeted support and improvement, which again is about consistently low performing student groups. And that's really what we're keyed in on today, is that student group performance and specifically the designation of additional targeted support and improvement. If you need more information or are still a little bit fuzzy about how the additional targeted support and improvement designation came to be, I encourage you to reach out to me individually. I'm glad to follow up with you. We also provided a lot of guidance on this in an initial webinar early in October, and would invite you to revisit that and rewatch that if that would be helpful. But know that we're comparing your student group in your school to the lowest 5% of Title I schools and all of the students in that lowest 5% of Title schools. And we're looking at multiple factors, including status, progress to language proficiency, multiple levels of growth or types of growth, and then 3 pieces that we put together in the end with the EBA, science, and chronic absenteeism. So we encourage you to review that designation, and if you need help, please reach out to me. Also wanted to just share with you that this is a statewide opportunity for us to have a discussion about student group performance. You'll see the distribution of the blue dots, those are our targeted support and improvement schools, and the orange dots, which represent our additional targeted support and improvement schools. The one thing that I would point out on this table over to the right side of your screen is the number of students with disabilities, student groups that we had identified. Over 2/3 of our student groups that were identified represent students that that have disabilities. So we know that this is a collective conversation that we need to be having, and that we are already having across the agency with our ESU partners and with districts. It's a shared responsibility for improvement and how we can support all of our student groups.
So what we wanted to do is provide a visualization of the concept of what we're trying to do here at the NDE, which is providing differentiated, intensified, and focused supports to our schools. So at the first here, you can see all of our schools classified as excellent, great, good, and needs improvement. And as we go up the pyramid, you can see how the intention is for those supports then to be tailored and be specific to the identified needs. So as an example, today's session, as we move up the pyramid, is specifically 4 schools are identified as ATSI, as we mentioned. So what we're gonna do now is move into the context of our schools and talk a little bit more about that.
Awesome.
So what we have here are some things that many of you are familiar with and some things that probably look somewhat redundant and very similar to one another. And what we see is that the continuous improvement process is cyclical. And there are a variety of different processes that are out there, from Victoria Bernhardt to our framework to MTSS, et cetera. And the two main things that we're focusing on today around resource allocation and evidence-based practices should really be embedded in these processes. And they shouldn't be seen as something that's separate or done in isolation of everything that you're doing here.
And across all of these 6 models, you notice that the first step is around that identification of a problem or identification of what is currently occurring in our schools. So that's where we're really going to start. And this graphic comes from Victoria Bernhardt. I hope that we're all familiar or have seen it before. But when we look at our student data, we have to really think about it in different aspects, in different ways. So we look at these 4 different types of data with school processes, showing how our classrooms are changing or are not changing over time, and the program implementation that we might or might not have in place. We look at demographics at the top, and that's things like enrollment and attendance, how our race and ethnicity has changed over time, gender and grade level, etc. We look at perceptions, which tells us a lot about how students are experiencing school and how parents and teachers are experiencing school. And finally, the student learning data that gives us an indication of multiple levels of performance, whether that's summative, formative, or interim assessments. And the magic really happens when we look at the interactions and the spaces where these data come together to really tell a complete picture of our schools.
Great. So what we're going to engage in now is actually our first breakout session, in which we're going to pair you up with other schools, districts, ESUs, whomever is on the Zoom here. And we'll ask you to introduce yourself, your role in your organization, and then use these questions as a guide to talk about your specific context. And then answer these questions based on your role. So if you're at a district or an ESU, you may talk about it a little bit more globally than if you were at a school, specifically working at one school specifically. We're going to provide you about 20 minutes, and what we have here for you is a note catcher. So you should have been able to access that from the beginning of our presentation here. And what you see here is that you're able to access the slide deck, and you also have all of the different breakouts with links and the questions for you to capture your learning and monitor that learning for yourself. So we're going to provide you with 20 minutes here for you to engage in that conversation with your colleagues. And if you could just bear with us one moment, we're going to break you up into rooms, and then you can start the conversation then. So welcome back. Thank you for engaging in those conversations about your specific context. And we want you to make sure that you keep that context in mind as we transition into the next strand of learning, which is around a resource allocation review. And Lane's going to walk us through that now.
Excellent. Thank you. So I always like to begin with the why. Why are we doing this? And especially around a resource allocation review, it really has to do with connecting the dots between the resources that we allocate and how they impact student achievement outcomes. So we have 4 major themes, 4 major places that we want to get to today with our conversations, and then have you continue within your schools and districts. The first is exactly what I said, connecting those resources with student achievement outcomes, broadly defined, right? We also know that this is a conversation, it's not a gotcha. It's an opportunity for us to have a high quality discussion and look at obstacles realistically and what is within our control. We also hope that this creates a sense of urgency in thinking about the ways we can leverage resources differently. Maybe we have the resources we need, and we need to think differently about time or things like that, that we do have an ability to change. And then the final piece that we're hoping to bring to the table today is around the integration of this process into the practice that you're currently doing with a continuous improvement plan or MTSS or any of those cycles that you may be engaging with. So I am a visual learner, and I come back to the picture that we showed at the very beginning where we have our students with diverse needs, right? And so the question really is, what do our students need? So once we have a glimpse of what our students need, then we can think differently about how we're allocating federal and state and local funding to meet those needs. What is our professional development focus within our school time and our PLCs? How are we allocating time, staff, and instructional materials to meet the needs of students? And these change year to year. So for example, we may look down into our rosters coming up with our students, and we see that there's an increased number of students with disabilities. That should change the way we think about the resources we need to allocate. We also may have a growing English learner population. How are we thinking differently there? Or it could be as simple as low math scores for the past 3 years across the board or with specific groups. And then how we are thinking differently around our allocation of resources. So once again, we see a cycle here. We have these 4 steps that really go into a resource allocation review, looking at identifying the resources, all of the resources that are mattering for student achievement. We then look at the analysis of these resources through an equity lens. We move to action and we think how we're literally going to make sure that we are addressing these inequities. And finally, we evaluate the effectiveness of those moves and we see whether they had actual benefits for student achievement. And if not, we do this process again. So today, we are really going to be engaging in these first 2 steps, identification of all of the resources that may be at our disposal to serve students and to lead to student achievement. And then we'll analyze them through an equity lens. So that's really the first thing we want to talk about. When we think about resources, our mind immediately goes to money. But really, these resources are broader than that. It's about our educators and their effectiveness in serving students. It's about time and the way that we're allocating time differently or flexibly for our students. It's about interventions and materials as well as funding. So what we really want you to be thinking about is what resources, broadly defined, impact student learning.
So we're actually going to break you up again into virtual Zoom rooms, and we have some guiding questions here, as you can see on your screen and your note catcher. And we'll provide you with 20 minutes to engage in this conversation about these questions that talk about your budget process, things you can control that probably you haven't thought about amending, and what's resonating with you as you engage in the conversation with your colleagues. The other thing we'd like to introduce into the mix now is this bit.ly on the bottom of your screen that's also in your note catcher that we can use as a virtual bulletin board. It's a way in which you're able to capture your thoughts and the conversations that you're having, and you can interact with others, like comments, and build on each other's comments on this virtual bulletin board. So as an example, we'll show you what that screen looks like. And as you can see here, we have participants from an earlier session that have already taken part and have broken up the bulletin board into the different conversations that they've been having here. So we'll give you another 20 minutes, and let's just give us a second while we break you up into the Zoom rooms. Great, so welcome back, and then welcome back. Let's take a look at the Padlet and see what were some of the responses that were shared. And what we see are some of the things that our colleagues mentioned were around the importance of rigorous and aligned materials, ensuring that we have a process that includes professional development, the different types of trainings that you're going to include for the upcoming year, and that staff are included, and that scheduling is critical. So the way in which you allocate your time is also important.
Yeah, one more common theme that I see here is the need for data systems that are supporting informed decision making, and that absolutely is an investment or a resource that is something that we're definitely thinking about at the NDE, and we know that schools are thinking about as well. Excellent. Thank you for engaging together and then on that Padlet.
So when we think about analyzing resources through an equity lens, it's really thinking about ensuring that we're not perpetuating a mentality of equality. So the first question is around, should person funding at every school be exactly the same? And that's a question of equality. And we are borrowing this language from EdTrust that has put out some information and resources around how to support our schools and school systems in engaging in these conversations. The second question really asks us to consider, well, if our students need more in order to catch up and then sustain that success, how do we get that to them? How do we make sure that we ensure that that happens? And that's a question of equity. And that question really at the bottom there, what's your goal in allocating resources, is something that we're going to dig into in a moment.
Yeah, and just to provide two quick examples. So we know that students with disabilities require additional support. And so providing that support is an example of equity, right? So one example of that could be paras or special education teachers, materials and interventions and additional time that reaches those students, our students with disabilities, differently. Some examples of resources that may not be as obvious might include professional development for our teachers that are serving, for all teachers that are serving students with disabilities, identification and the reallocation of the most effective teachers to those special education classes.
And then another example is around the culturally relevant materials and pedagogical practices that can be employed, which are important to ensure the academic success of all students, and in particular, students of color that may not necessarily be represented as vastly as other students. And the other thing we want to think about when equal is not equitable is that, like Lane mentioned earlier, it's not so much or solely about funding and the money that we have, but the extent to which it's actually supporting the outcomes that we want to see. So opportunity and outcome gaps persist even when funding increases. And how well those funds are used is critical to improving student outcomes. So as you can see, taking into account the budget and also the distribution of your most effective teachers will have an effect on the outcomes that your students will experience. So how much is only one part of the story, and we should consider other pieces to bring into the conversation, such as capturing teacher quality and the rigor of the materials and the curriculum.
So we're going to continue the breakout conversation around this specifically. So in the one previously, you thought about all of the resources that are at your fingertips. With this one, we specifically want you to think about, well, how are you putting those into place or into action? So thinking about how are you evaluating the unique needs of your schools and your districts if you're at the district level, thinking about how are you evaluating the unique needs of your students at the school level. So we want to think about allocating funding differently and allocating resources differently, and that's really where we want you to zero in this breakout session. Once again, we ask that you maybe summarize some of your thoughts in this Padlet that is on the bit.ly, as well as in your note catcher. So we're going to take about 20 minutes here as well to engage with our conversations. If you'll give us just a moment as we set up the breakout sessions.
Great, so welcome back. Thank you again for engaging in this conversation.
As we look at the Padlet, we can show that there are a couple of key themes here as well. A couple of the things that I really wanted to point out, one was around this, this idea of sustainability. So ensuring that we're not just doing shiny, new things that we think may work, right? And that kind of gets into this conversation that we're moving to around evidence-based practices. The other piece was about being creative with leveraging existing resources. So we know that the pot of money that is available for serving our students with diverse needs and growing needs is not increasing, unfortunately. So we have to be creative about the ways that we do that. I think that was those were the two pieces that I really wanted to point out here. And you can check out some of your colleagues' thoughts and like their comments or add to their comments as we move forward. So the third step in our process for a resource allocation review is really thinking about, well, what next? We started by identifying our resources. We looked at how we were allocating those, and we maybe saw some gaps. So now the third part that you need to engage in is really, what are we going to do about it? So specifically, think about strategies that you could use or implement quickly and easily or through the long term to promote cost savings and efficiencies. Some of that could be the fidelity of the implementation of the processes that you're including. We also want you to think about which are our largest and most important inequities that we identified and how can we address those first. And the final piece is around be sure that you have a realistic timeline put in place around that process. So once again, we talked about the first two steps. This third step is really going to be needed for you to go on your own. So what are we going to do about it? What necessary steps do we need to take to address these inequities?
And one of the things I will add really quickly to kind of bookend this portion here is that for some of you, depending on the size of your district, you may be a little far removed from how much decision-making control you have in relation to how some resources may be allocated in your specific school or district. And what we want to push you to think about is what you can do that is within your control around potentially the materials, the staffing, et cetera. And also know that we're starting the statewide conversation, right? So we want to make sure that we're engaging multiple stakeholders in this learning and that we're continuing to grow in our ability to provide guidance to support schools and districts in this really powerful work.
Great. Just so you know, these are the two questions that will be included in the follow-up survey. So once again, we kind of highlighted or foreshadowed that survey as a requirement from the U.S. Department of Education and also just a pulse check for us to see where our schools are. But we're going to ask you specifically, what did this resource allocation review that we started and that you're going to continue reveal about potential inequities in your school? And then we're going to ask in a second question, a follow-up, what action steps will you do to ensure that student groups have the resources they need to succeed? So this isn't meant to be a gotcha. This is an opportunity for us to learn about what you're finding out, what additional resources you may need from us, and what next steps we can do to support this conversation statewide, as Shirley mentioned.
Great. So we're actually going to take a 15-minute break. And what we'd like for you to do is not disconnect from the Zoom, but just, you can mute your screen, mute your audio, and we'll come back together in 15 minutes. So we can pick up where we left off. We'll be right back. See you soon. All right, so welcome back. And now we're going to pick up with our next strand of learning, which is focused on evidence-based practices, and Lane's going to start us off with this section.
Excellent. All right. So again, I like to start out with the why we're doing this. And if we think about kind of the key differences between No Child Left Behind, or NCLB, and ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, one of the biggest things, I actually heard this at a conference with NCLB, somebody said that everything was either required or forbidden. With ESSA, we have so much flexibility, both at the statewide level at NDE and also specifically in our districts. We also see a major shift, and it sounds like semantics, but we're going to get into the importance of the discussion around research-based versus evidence-based. So for the first time, ESSA defines what is meant by an evidence-based intervention. And while all evidence-based interventions are probably research-based, the opposite is not always true. And we'll get into what we mean by that. But in general, evidence-based means that the efficacy has been evaluated by someone other than the organization that developed the strategy. So the outcome was positive for students. It showed that doing this in this specific context and in this specific way led to a student achievement gain.
Great. So you probably have also heard us and others across the state and nation using intervention, strategy, program, etc., interchangeably. And per the ESSA law, intervention, strategies, and practices are collectively just referred to as interventions. And what we're doing here, we're borrowing from the Ohio Department of Education here, is the nuance between the depth of which you can be including evidence-based programs, practices, or activities. So for example, an evidence-based program is a package set of lessons or additional academic content that is used to teach a particular subject or grade level and can be an intervention or product. And they provide the example of core knowledge, language arts. A practice is something that is introduced, developed, or is necessary to improve a particular skill. And it can be a method, an approach, or a particular strategy. And they provide the example of develop awareness of the segments of sounds and speech and how they link to letters. And then an activity specific gets even smaller in grain size around what students are actually doing to learn or practice a particular skill. And here you see the example around reading passages chorally and paying attention to the phrasing and then provided feedback. So we wanted to make sure that we provide you at least some nuance in the definition when we're talking about an evidence-based intervention or practice or strategy. And what we also wanted to do with this is think about, well, when or how would we implement an evidence-based strategy? And the Nebraska MTSS framework provides us a really great concept around when and how there could be a mix of these things. So it's possible that you could be providing an evidence-based intervention during core instruction, and it could also be increasing with intensity as you go up the pyramid here. So we just want to provide this as a tool, as a framework, so that you can see that students may receive a series of services in all of these areas at any point in time.
Awesome. And as this is a new form of support that we're providing, there's naturally some misconceptions that may come along with that, including the ones that you see on your screen here. So how would you respond to these misconceptions that are up on the screen?
Yeah, these misconceptions really shed light on some of the things that are necessary for us to engage in, especially when we're thinking about addressing the needs of our students through an equity lens. And I would challenge us to move beyond running up this pyramid and seeking the most intensive intervention without interrogating and examining the core instruction that we have in place that should be designed for our learners to have multiple entry points and have access to and experience success within high quality instruction.
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate one point that you made up above, those instructional materials may be high quality and they may be evidence-based, but we may have to supplement them with other evidence-based, culturally responsive materials that meet the needs of our diverse learners. So as we think about evidence-based practices and thinking about those interventions, activities, all of those words that we had been describing, that different grain sizes Shirley was mentioning, can be real tempting for us to think of this as a shopping cart mentality, where we're walking down and we see all of these great things that are meeting the evidence-based requirements, and we're pulling them off the shelf without considering whether or not they actually meet the needs of our students. So we're asking you to think really critically about the needs of your students first, and then meeting them with the relevant evidence-based practices that will help your students to succeed.
And we also wanted to provide you an analogy in thinking about when you receive a prescription for a particular medication for an ailment you may have, in which a doctor may only provide that prescribed medication after a clear diagnosis has been identified. And it's carefully selected, and it's a particular prescription or a particular medication that has been tested multiple times through rigorous trials to determine its effectiveness. And we also know that it has to be taken as directed to ensure its effectiveness as well. So we look to the medical field at times to, come up with a lot of analogies, and this is yet another one to provide an analogy for evidence-based practices.
Awesome. So as we think about where we are in this evidence-based practice selection process, it's really key, as we've said multiple times now, to understand our student needs really well before we go to that selection process. We also want to reiterate that this normally wouldn't occur in February, right? It should be integrated seamlessly into other continuous improvement processes. But for the sake of our understanding of the evidence-based interventions that you're using, we're going to zero in on the second bubble here, which is around the relevant evidence-based interventions that you may be using.
Great. So before we get into this independent activity for 10 minutes, we want to provide just a little bit more context around these clearinghouse sites. So the clearinghouses basically just hold all of this evidence information, and some of them are very particular to particular themes. So for example, Evidence for ESSA actually has a wide breadth of information around reading, math, attendance, science, writing, whereas social programs at work are very specific to the community and the context of the specific school that it's in. National Center for Safe Supportive Safe Supportive Learning Environments is just as it sounds, also really focused on more behavioral and contextual interventions that can be implemented. And the Nebraska MTSS program comparison focuses on evidence-based practices that Nebraska educators are implementing and have been vetted through our MTSS and UNL office. One thing you might not see here, although we provided an example when describing evidence-based programs, is ed reports. We know that we have a large push in our state around high quality instructional materials. And ed reports is not present because what we want to make sure we focus on here on this slide specifically is the fact that these specific interventions have been vetted for their effectiveness. So like Lane mentioned in the earlier slide when introducing evidence-based practices, it's really for a strategy that was considered evidence-based. Its efficacy must have been evaluated by someone other than just the people or organizations that developed the strategy. Ed reports is focusing on instructional shifts, and while important, when we're implementing evidence-based practices, we want to make sure they're of highest quality and have been demonstrated to have a positive effect. So we're going to provide you 10 minutes to do that, and we challenge you to be critical consumers because something is strong evidence or promising evidence or whatever the case is, as you see on these sites. We want to make sure that you're taking that information in mind with the context that you're currently in. So the links are on your note catcher and you can go ahead and explore those sites and take 10 minutes and we'll be right back.
Awesome. Thank you for that great exploration activity. We hope that you had a little bit of time to just kind of preview what is present out there for us to support the work that we're doing. So just like anything else, not all evidence was created equal. And so as I mentioned before, ESSA really helps us put some clarity to the tiers of evidence. We're going to dig in a little bit to what we mean by that. So we want to start with the first tier, which is all around the strong evidence. So the key and defining feature of strong evidence in this level is that there was a well-designed scientific or experimental study. If you're unfamiliar with what an experimental study is, you can kind of see a description of it here on the screen with this picture, in that we look at a population of interest. That could be students in a school, or it could be a significant number of students across the country. We then randomly assign those students or that school into two different groups. One that is called the treatment group, one that is the control group. The treatment, as the name implies, receives the intervention and the control does not. As we look at the end of this graphic, you then see that the final piece is that we compare those groups. We know that they were similar at the beginning, so we're able to see how much the intervention impacted either achievement, attendance, or whatever the outcome of interest is. So as we look at the evidence for ESSA website, you'll see that this is abundantly clear in some of the pieces there. So again, we'll just look, for example, at Success for All, a whole class intervention for reading. As we click in there, we first notice that the ESSA rating is strong. We also see the number of studies that were utilized to uncover the effect size here that we have, as well as the number of students that were involved in it. Brief description, the outcomes, as well as some things that are about how we actually implement these processes. So we just name that and share that as an example of the tier 1 strong evidence that we are really pushing schools to consider. And if we take a step back momentarily and think about this, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is ensure that the investments that we're making and the time that we're spending is actually going to have an impact on student achievement. As we move into tier 2, this is really about moderate evidence. So we know that there was at least one well-designed quasi-experimental study. And you see the difference in this chart here that is on the screen. With quasi-experimental, which is right in the middle, we know that there are still a control and a treatment group, but the two groups were not randomly assigned. Instead, we look at matching groups as well as possible using variables such as demographics, age, gender, or other important factors that might otherwise explain the results. So we're looking at that quasi-experimental. It's not quite as rigorous, but still is important and an opportunity for an evidence level. As we look at tier 3, we start to see that a little of the rigor in our results and in our study is lacking. So I demonstrate that a little bit flippantly here with a correlational study that kind of demonstrates the promising evidence. So you see on our screen, sunglasses sold increase as ice cream sales increase. And one could quickly think that those two are related because of one another. We all know that there's probably a spurious or outside factor that is actually implementing or influencing both. To bring it back to education, we can think about an example of Los Angeles Unified School District and Harvard University that did a study of schools and teachers specifically that had a certificate and earned the national board certification process. They saw that there was a correlation and an increase in student learning by 2 months compared to peers that did not have the national board certification. However, they couldn't claim for certain that that certification in and of itself was the reason that there was an increase in student achievement outcomes. They could have just been more effective teachers before they actually reached that certification. So we just need to be a little bit careful, and again, kind of that savvy consumer of information as we get to these lower levels of evidence. The final piece of evidence, or the final tier of evidence, is tier 4, which is described as demonstrates a rationale. So with demonstrates a rationale, we know that there's at least one positive evaluation of some kind and a well thought out logic model. You see an example of a logic model here where we see inputs that lead to outputs that ultimately lead to outcomes. So we need to see both of those things, a positive evaluation and a logic model in this tier 4. An example of this is competency-based education. We know that competency-based education is used in higher ed and medicine, and that it has theory behind it as well. However, there has not been a study at the K through 12 level of competency-based education. And so we therefore are unable to say whether it has actual effects on students. We know that it could, we just don't know that it has in other studies. Another example is micro-credentialing for career readiness. In theory, it sounds great. There just has not been a study yet on its effectiveness for our teachers and ultimately for our students.
And we also know that we also want to be mindful of the fact that for some, like Lane has just described, for some different factors, there may be a small evidence base to choose from. So we are aware that that is the case. We want to make sure that we just provide you with the definitions and some guidance around what it means to select evidence-based interventions. So some other considerations to keep in mind, and there's a little video that you can watch on your own for about 5 minutes or so. It's just, what is it that we should be keeping in mind when we're selecting an evidence-based practice? And the first is the study design. And how Lane has been talking about this, which is great. It's around, well, was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it something that was attempting to be correlational? Also looking at the results of the study. We want to make sure that we're looking at things that have a positive effect on the outcomes that we're seeking to have. Ensuring that we're seeing findings from related studies, like we have pulled up evidence for ESSA. We're seeing that there are other evidence-based that we can pull from, as well as the sample size and setting paired with the final bullet around how the students and the setting overlap with your school or district. So really thinking about how applicable is the research, is the evidence that you're selecting for that program or intervention going to then interact with your specific context.
Yeah, and the important note is that you are probably already implementing evidence-based practices. The question then is, how can you refine those, target those, or focus those to really first meet the ESSA requirements, and second, meet the specific needs of a specific student group that you may be designated for ATSI.
Great, so we're going to engage in one more breakout room here. And what we'd like for you to do now, when we first started this segment, we asked you to just engage in those websites. And now that you have some more context around the fact that they're not only identifying different themes of types of interventions that you can implement in your schools or districts, it also denotes the level of evidence. So we want to make sure that we provide you with that context now and have an opportunity to look at these sites again. And this time discuss with your colleagues in your breakout rooms around the expansion of your understanding of selecting EBPs, as well as maybe practices that you already have in place that meet these guidelines. And ultimately, what are some other programs, practices, or activities that you may need to explore? So we'll give you about 15 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back in a moment. Great, thank you so much for engaging in that learning. Really appreciate that. And
awesome. So we just want to reiterate that while we've been kind of communicating with you that there is no need for a new plan for ATSI, and we ask and have been pushing you to think about how you can specifically tailor or amend some of your current plans, your CIP plans, MTSS, whatever the case may be, there are some specific things that we need to know. So one of the purposes for this webinar was for us to introduce these topics and to also let you know that we will be following up to understand some of the work that is occurring around this topic. So while no new plan, we do need to know some of the practices that are going on in your school. So just so you know, here are 3 more questions that will be included in the survey that we follow up with. You'll see that survey, some snapshots of that survey at the end of this presentation. But now, after engaging with the conversation on evidence-based programs and practices, we're asking you to think about the focus area and give us an example of one that you're implementing. In that pink square, we're asking you also to think about the evidence level of that evidence-based practice. And then finally, we just need to know and get an idea of some of the description that you have, telling us a little bit about the programs and practices or activities that you have in place. To know that that will be a follow-up to this conversation. And then we look forward to learning to how we can continue the conversation and support you.
great, thanks. So now we're going to move into the third strand of our learning for the day, which is around continued networking and exploration of equity-centered tools. The first one that we'll share with you is the cultural proficiency continuum, in which this continuum is a framework for describing a range of 6 responses to diversity, starting from the left, cultural destructiveness, all the way to the right, cultural proficiency. And what we're seeing here is that this is ongoing work, an essential part to school improvement teams whose work is to expand learning opportunities to more students. And what we're seeing from those that are in the red are really more compliance-based, tolerant activities or practices. We want to make sure that we're moving towards the green, which are more transformational for advancing and achieving equity in our schools and systems.
So what we would invite you to do is just take a moment and think about where are you yourself on this cultural proficiency continuum. Understanding that cultural proficiency isn't something we do or are, it's something that we work towards, as Shirley mentioned. So where would you place yourself on this cultural proficiency continuum? And then where would you place your organization, your school, your district, your ESU, or if you're an NDE member, where would you place NDE? So in your note catcher, you'll find both the link to this cultural proficiency continuum, as well as these 2 guiding questions that we invite you to just spend some time reflecting on.
Great, thanks. So what we're also seeing here are some supports for equity-centered school improvement. And while the session we've been talking about applying an equity lens or thinking about things differently, being critical consumers of information, we also know that at times when we're implementing different programs, activities, or strategies, they're not going to affect change, and they won't definitely be sustainable if the proper mindsets, beliefs, and dispositions are not in place to meet the needs of our diverse learners. So what we want to do is give you some time to engage in these 3 specific tools. The first is the NDE Digital Learning Center that has the Leading for Equity in Our Schools module, so that you can take a moment to review the different sections that we have there that are filled with different topics and have strategies and resources for you to continue to dig into. The next we have is Unbound Ed. This organization has created a really powerful toolkit around engaging in conversations around bias, and how those perceptions and those unconscious beliefs have a very visible impact in the things that we do. And then lastly, we have the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center here that is linked to the different equity tools that they have, everything from assessing bias and standards and curricular materials, such as they supported us this past year with the social studies standards, to how we can frame different conversations in team meetings. So we want to provide you with 15 to 20 minutes in your breakout rooms to engage in these conversations around how these tools can promote a more equity-centered school improvement process that really focuses on solving problems for kids. And then we ask that you find a resource that you wish to explore personally and, you know, really engage your own personal development and personal learning there. And then lastly, what's a resource that you could bring back to your team no matter where you are in our educational ecosystem, that you can explore collectively and think about together.
Once again, these resources will go back so that you can see those. Those are linked on our slide here. You just click on the pictures here, and then that'll take you there.
They're also in our note catcher.
They are in the note catcher, and we will make sure that you take down some notes on your note catcher as well. So we'll go ahead and mute and break into breakout session.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for engaging in that conversation with your colleagues. I hope you're exchanging numbers and really thinking about, you know, ways in which you can push each other and support one another in collaborative problem solving.
Awesome. So as we kind of round out our time together, we want to just end with the what's next. And as we've been foreshadowing throughout this session, we will be following up with a survey by the close of business today that is around the additional targeted support specifically. We're looking at two big buckets of information to collect from you. The first is the results from this resource allocation review that we've been talking about and that we began. The second is to get just a high-level information about the evidence-based practices that you are implementing. We do ask for a pretty quick turnaround in that we would like to have these surveys by Monday, February 24th, at the close of business. We need this at the ATSI school level, and we only need one survey response per school. So even though your school may have been identified for multiple student groups, we only need one from each school. You notice we put the Department of Ed, the US Department of Ed's logo up in the top, and that's because this is a requirement from the federal statute that we get a pulse again and an understanding of these two areas for our ATSI schools. Just to provide you a couple of screenshots of what this actually looks like, you'll see on the left-hand side, these are the two questions that we just showed you on resource allocation. And on the right-hand side, one part of the evidence-based practices that we're asking you to look at. Now, you may not be looking at all of these focus areas, and if not, just put not applicable. But we are looking at the things that you're doing now or in the future to really zero in on the needs of this student group. So once again, I'll come back to this slide and just say that this will be a follow-up survey that we'll send out in addition to this video. And we need that survey once again by February 24th at the school level.
Great, so to wrap up our day here, we just want to revisit our objectives, and that was to conduct a resource allocation review to determine inequities and chart next steps, deepen our understanding of evidence-based practices and determine what's best for our schools, and network with identified schools through exploration of equity-centered tools and resources. And we also know that this is us starting a statewide conversation. Many of you may be engaging in these conversations at your local level. We want to make sure that we elevate those conversations and really think about what are some statewide solutions to some of the problems that we're experiencing collectively. So here we have a feedback survey that we would love to get your feedback on around our session today, specifically for our objectives. And we also want to make sure that you let us know how your experience went. It's also at the bottom of the note catcher, so make sure you can access it from there, or you can use your camera from your phone, your smartphone, and capture that QR code there. And one last thing before we finally log off is a quick plug for Strengthening the Core coming to Kearney July 13th through the 15th. And there will be more details to come, such as registration, logistical things, and the different strands of learning that you can expect. So we thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you very soon.
Thank you all.